Hi guys, this is Saehee. I am here with Jeremy Stein from the Center for the Holy Land Studies at the Assemblies of God National Office. Today we're going to talk about Book of Jonah. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining me today. And Book of Jonah is really a fun book. There are only 4 chapters in the book. You can just breeze through, right? But there are so many unspoken stories. In fact, if you want to know anything about the Bible, you want to go back to their culture, right?
Absolutely.
So kind of tell us about what was actually happening while Jonah was going through all this process and being called by God to go to Nineveh where he just so hated to go.
Well, Jonah's interesting because he's at a time in Israel's history where there are 2 kingdoms. You have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Judah. And Jonah is during the time of Jeroboam II in the north. And the north is really having clashes with many of the different empires that are surrounding them. The north was very powerful. They were very, very wealthy. And we find this very, very positively shown inside the book of Kings especially, where you have powerful kings such as Ahab and Omri who bring this northern kingdom into a place of political stability in its world that day. Now you have them going to war with other countries such as Egypt, but you don't see anybody as prevalent inside Israel's history as you do with the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire was Israel's neighbors to the north, and you find them continually warring against them. Now Assyria was very much based in not only its pagan lifestyle, but also a culture of warfare. They were incredibly brutal, incredibly violent. They seriously evolved warfare in a way that the world had never seen it. We look in the archaeological records in the land of Israel today, and cities that we can go to that we've dug up in the last 50, 60 years, and see really the path of destruction that Israel would go through again and again and be subjected to by the Assyrian Empire. One such city is the city of Lachish, which is down in the south in Judah. After the northern kingdom is destroyed, we find Assyria making its way to try to attack Jerusalem, and on its way it attacks every single city. And it attacks Lachish so passionately that the king, when he returns back to the capital of Nineveh, he has the walls of his palace inscribed with his victory at Lachish. And it's almost heartbreaking to see what Israel had gone through under the sieges of Lachish. We find the introduction of really the first steps of crucifixion being introduced into the land of Israel. It predates the Roman Empire, where you find men that are tied to stakes and their bodies are torn apart just to make a simple message to those around them. We find men and women being dragged into slavery. We find children being beheaded and their heads being placed in piles outside of the city gate so that people would be warned from miles and miles away of hey, this is what Assyria does. Even worse, when they take prisoners of war, they would take their flesh and they would flay them, and then, which was the removal of all flesh. And then they take their bodies and they put them in a vat of salt so that the body would go into shock. Then they would take the skin that was removed from these people and they would write messages on it and send it to other cities such as Jerusalem so that they would know, hey, Assyria is coming and they mean business. Either bow to us, submit to our will, or be destroyed. And so Jonah has now grown up in a culture very similarly to what we see in modern day Israel of warfare, where year after year and generation after generation of intense animosity and hatred has brought Jonah to a place where he has no love for these people, even though knowing that they are part of God's creation, even though knowing that God has a love for them and God has a message for them, he has absolutely no love for them.
Right, and just knowing that background helps us so much understand better where Jonah is coming from, because Jonah has this, I guess he's famous for being known as a reluctant prophet, right? And we just look at this story and it sounds like he's always running away from the Lord. And he knows that God can hear him. Obviously, he believes in the omnipresent God, right? And yet he feels like he can just run away as far as he could, right? He's going to Tarshish. So where is Tarshish?
Tarshish is about the area of Spain.
Okay.
So he's trying to literally get all the way on the other side of the known world at that point, which was even a far stretch for those who were going over the Mediterranean. It was dangerous at this time. Ships were not really that capable of very long journeys. Only until really the Greek and Roman empires do we find these journeys being much more common. So for Jonah to do this, it's a big step of almost faith in himself that he's going to get there. But somewhat faith in God that God's going to get him there as well, even though he's running from God.
Right, and Jonah's ministry is so unique in that in the Old Testament prophets, God will tell them to maybe speak to the other nations, but not directly. But for Jonah, God was telling him to go directly to Nineveh and talk to them, which was Israelites' enemy, which is very unusual for the Old Testament prophets, correct? Yeah, and then now we're talking about how, he has this bad name, but then it almost seems like it's justifiable because of this historical context and cultural things, correct?
I'd absolutely say that. I think when we look at Jonah as a character and we almost compare him to our own lives, suddenly some things start lining up. And Jonah, when he's brought up in this lifestyle, as I said, he's undoubtedly terrified. He walks into this city and he's an enemy. He's not a friend to these people. And he gives them a message of destruction, that their empire is going to come to an end. He essentially knows that, God, if I deliver this message, they're going to kill me. And Jonah's life, it seems at this point, has been nothing but blessing. His messages, unlike many of the other prophets of his day, his messages seem to be well accepted. Even in Jeroboam's kingdom, it would be not uncommon for a true prophet of the Lord's messages to be pushed aside. We see this in similar accounts, such as in Elijah or Elisha. Both of them are products of the northern kingdom, and Elijah has to run for his life.
Right.
He's forced out by the same essential dynasty or same lineage of wicked kings that is prevalent still in Jonah's day. Right. So it becomes almost, I'd say, somewhat acceptable at that point to understand Jonah's plight and the internal struggle and the internal battle that's happening inside his mind of, God, why are you calling me to do this? This is utter certain death, no matter what.
Right. And you can see the human side of Jonah so much when he goes to Nineveh and talks to them and say this message, right, as a prophet, as a man of God. And he just says one thing, right? And he doesn't give him this whole message, but he says, in 3 days, you're going to be destroyed. And that's it. And he just walks away, right?
Absolutely. It's amazing. You know what? We've become many times people of the text. People of the story and not of the text, where we think that Jonah goes in there, and we have these almost childlike stories that we learned growing up in Sunday school, that Jonah goes in there and says, repent. And God will turn himself away. But really, when we look at the text, Jonah never says that. Instead, he just tells them, you're going to be destroyed, which lets us see kind of a little bit of his hatred even before God has to put him in his place, that he doesn't want these people to be saved. He doesn't want God to rescue them and God to turn his wrath away from them. And it's really the king of Nineveh, the pagan king, who sits his people down and says, maybe if we change our ways, then God will hold his wrath against us.
And I think Jonah also understood that God is a gracious God, a merciful God. And he probably was afraid that God will forgive them, which, and you will later, the end of the story, really. But just the whole journey, just seeing Jonah dragging along this calling to go there and just having gone through so much trouble throughout the whole time. And I guess it comes down to this big question, and it may be the silly question too. Big fish, a whale, and I know it sounds like a silly question, but it also is an important question to ask when it comes to the historicity of the book of Jonah. So kind of unpack that a little bit.
Absolutely. The Hebrew is actually very specific. It calls it a great fish or a large fish. And only in later sources, really in the Latin, is the first time we find the idea of a whale being brought into the story. And part of the reason why we find the use of a fish here is simply because of some of the chief gods that are worshipped inside the pagan world at the time of Jonah. We find specifically the god Dagon, who really shows up in the Bible as a Philistine god, but many of the cultures and the pagan religions and pagan empires of the Old Testament tend to borrow and share gods. And really the Philistines have taken Dagon from the Phoenicians, who are much more attached to the sea and being sea-bearing people. They were traders and merchants and fishermen and sailors. And really from there, even still you have from the god Dagon, you find almost this merman-like description of him with a fish tail and sometimes a fish head in certain pagan religions. And so you have almost the culmination of the Hebrew Bible working with the pagan worlds of the day to tell a story so that not only would those of Hebrew background, those of a Jewish background would understand, but those of a pagan background who understood the gods of the pagan world and said, okay, you know, he has this connection to the fish, and maybe this is why those who worship the fish god would submit to maybe his message and understand that, hey, God's not messing around.
Mm-hmm. That's so true. And I think there's Jonah, like you said earlier, there's Jonah in every part of our lives. I mean, there's Jonah in me. You know, when God calls me to do something, and there's a part of me that says, you know, God, maybe not this time, you know, or maybe just outright disobedience, and I'm not going that way. But then there's a way when God wills it, and He plans it, then His will be accomplished. And I think Jonah's story is wonderful, a reflection for all of us to take home and think about how we can live a life of faithfulness to God, even when we are so unfaithful to the Lord. Thank you, Jeremy, so much for your talk and all this information. And I hope that you take it home and just really contemplate with it and ponder upon it. And maybe we'll talk more about this later in our discussion.